order. Ben Maguire to move the motion.
I beg to move that this House has considered rural crime. It's a pleasure to serve with you in the chair, Ms McVeigh, and a privilege to open this important debate on rural crime. It's also fantastic to see many honourable members from all sides of this House joining the debate today, and I'd like to thank all the members for their attendance. As someone who grew up in the rural constituency of North Cornwall, which I now proudly serve as a Member of Parliament, my family, friends and many others are acutely aware of the dangers that rural crime can bring and the drastic effects that it can have on our small, tight-knit communities. It's an issue that has for far too long been overlooked and not made a priority by successive governments. Yet for those living and working in our rural communities, the impact of rural crime can be absolutely devastating. Let me be crystal clear. Rural crime is very rarely random or opportunistic, and it has not been given the attention it deserves from successive governments. Evidence overwhelmingly shows that rural crime is now dominated by organised criminal gangs who operate with sophistication across police forces and systematically target farmers, tradesmen and rural businesses. And I'm not just talking about the occasional theft of a piece of farm equipment. This is large-scale, coordinated and organised criminal activity with criminal networks exploiting gaps in policing resources.
Can my honourable friend give way?
I will give way.
Thank you very much for giving way. Thank you, Madam Chair, serving under your chairmanship. Thank you. Sadly, my constituency of North Devon has recently suffered in the last week a spate of rural break-ins on the edge of Exmoor. A quad bike and a chainsaw were stolen from sheds in West Anstey earlier this month in a pattern we're very familiar with. But just this past week, South Moulton and Umberley joined a string of other Devon villages where thieves struck local shops and service stations overnight, believed to be targeting cigarettes. Does my honourable friend agree with me that when we talk about rural crime, what we're really talking about is the perception amongst criminals that rural areas are soft targets for obtaining goods that can be easily fenced elsewhere?
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and I completely agree, and I'll come on to cover that type of rural crime, and completely agree that we've become far too much of a soft touch for these organised criminal gangs. If we want to tackle crime in this country, we must start finally taking rural crime seriously. The latest figures from NFU Mutual put the total cost of rural crime in 2023 at £52.8 million, an increase from the year before of 4.3%. But these figures only reflect insured losses, and the true cost is likely far higher, as many don't even have trust or confidence that the crimes will be properly investigated when they're reported. Particularly troubling is the explosion in thefts of high-value equipment. GPS theft surged by 137% last year, costing £4.2 million, and farmers cannot simply replace these overnight. Thefts of quad bikes and ATVs, which are critical equipment for farmers and rural workers, rose by 9% to £3.2 million. And livestock theft remained at an alarming £2.7 million, with evidence of animals being butchered in the fields they were stolen from, causing immense distress to farmers. These are farmers who, after botched Brexit trade deals thanks to the Conservatives, and who now face a family farm tax in light of this Labour government's changes to APR, are suffering from the scourge of rural organised crime, which is often theft to order. The toll on farmers' mental health and well-being from these crimes is enormous, and my own inbox has been inundated with such cases from North Cornwall. One farmer saw his £17,000 all-terrain vehicle stolen in the dead of night, and it wasn't the first time thieves had targeted his property. Another farmer in the village of St Kew lost more than £3,000 in the blink of an eye when thieves broke in and stole vehicles, tools and equipment that he relied on for his livelihood. And finally, one farming couple in Blisland had 2 quad bikes taken from their locked garage, costing £15,000 to replace. With this particular theft, police travelled all the way from Totnes, a 3-hour round trip, showing up 3 days after the event. They put a few signs around the property, and the farmers haven't heard from them since. These stories make it unsurprising, then, that 86% of countryside residents said rural crime was negatively impacting their mental well-being, as highlighted by various surveys conducted by the NFU. And yet, one of the most underreported aspects of rural crime is the mass theft of power tools and machinery from tradesmen and small businesses. It's a crime that exceeds farm machinery theft in total volume. The figures are staggering. Of the over 3,600 stolen tools recovered by the National Crime Unit, only 77 were successfully returned to their owners. That's just 2%, an abysmal rate of return, with huge impacts on the livelihoods of these tradesmen. These thefts can devastate builders, carpenters, plumbers, and others who rely on expensive, specialised equipment to earn a living. When tools are stolen, jobs are lost, deadlines are missed, and insurance costs soar. Yet manufacturers sometimes outright refuse, in some cases, to cooperate with crime prevention efforts, as there's no legal requirement currently for forensic markings or GPS tracking on these high-value power tools to help with the recovery of this equipment. And the trust of... I will give way.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way. He may be aware that in the last Parliament, a private member's bill that I brought forward that's now an Act, the Equipment Theft Prevention Act 2023, would, through secondary legislation, enable that requirement on power tool manufacturers to fit forensic marking. It just requires secondary legislation. It was discussed at all stages of debate, both in the House of Commons and the House of Lords during its passage, and therefore would he support my calls from back then and again now on the new government to look at bringing that secondary legislation to make that Act apply equally to power tools?
Ben Maguire.
I thank the honourable member for that intervention, and I certainly do, along with my Liberal Democrat colleagues, support that change, and I will come on to discuss that just slightly later in my speech. The trust of our rural communities have in police forces to solve these crimes is shockingly low, with just 2/3 of respondents to one survey saying that reporting rural crime is a total waste of time, as they know it will go unsolved. The government could reopen some of the smaller police stations in rural areas, like Launceston in my North Cornwall constituency, so that these crimes can be reported and dealt with by the front desks, which would certainly be a start in regaining the public's trust and confidence. In July 2023, as the honourable member just mentioned, Parliament passed the Equipment Theft Prevention Act, aiming to deter thefts of farm vehicles by requiring immobilisers and registration databases. That was a clear step forward, but unfortunately it didn't do quite enough to tackle the true scale of the problem, as that legislation doesn't cover GPS units, power tools or smaller high-value equipment, which are among the most frequently stolen items. So will the government consider the merits of extending that legislation to ensure all GPS systems, power tools, high-value rural equipment are required to have forensic markings and registration databases? Because, I'm going to just carry on for a moment, because without proper enforcement and action, we're leaving the van door wide open for thieves. And while rural crime grows, police forces remain underfunded, overstretched and lacking specialist knowledge needed to combat these offences. In many cases, local police don't have the resources, staff or capability to track and recover farm equipment and power tools at the rate they're stolen. These crimes are committed across wide areas and often too small to warrant the attention of large-scale organisations like the National Crime Agency, but too big for individual forces to deal with on their own. That's where the National Rural Crime Unit comes in, a vital national coordination centre that does some excellent work in the recovery of stolen property, sharing intelligence across forces and disrupting these organised criminal gangs. But shockingly, the National Rural Crime Unit is set to lose its single national crime coordinator this year due to a lack of funding. The role has been essential in tackling cross-border rural crime, linking intelligence between forces and coordinating national efforts to combat criminal gangs. But without continued funding, this vital work will collapse. Furthermore, the NRCU is entirely industry funded, yet as it stands, the government takes 50% of all cash assets seized from criminal gangs, which is unable to be returned to the victims. This 50% could instead go directly back into fighting the criminal gangs and supporting the work of organisations like the NRCU. So I would please ask the Minister to commit to providing long-term funding for the NRCU to allow it to continue its critical work and deliver greater coordination between local forces to tackle rural crime. Because as it stands, this government is relying on the insurance industry to fund rural crime policing, and in the view of me and my constituents, it's unacceptable. County line drug gangs have increasingly infiltrated Cornwall and other rural areas across the country, exploiting vulnerable individuals, including children, to traffic and sell drugs across the region. In Bodmin, for instance, these gangs took over the homes of vulnerable residents, a practice known commonly as cuckooing, to establish bases for their illicit operations. These gangs, again, operate across vast rural areas and often in sparsely populated towns and villages. This requires proper resourcing to ensure they are properly policed. And the costs of rural crime extend beyond humans, often harming our natural environment and the animals that live within it. Illegal snaring, hare coursing, poaching, and other criminal activity has decimated and traumatised wildlife populations in North Cornwall and across the country. Not to mention the huge problem of fly tipping, which comes up time and time again from my constituents, where rubbish is illegally dumped in our towns and across our countryside. To combat this issue specifically, the government could consider a single reporting mechanism for fly tipping, so that landowners and farmers need only report an incident once and will have the confidence that it will be followed up on. Despite facing unique challenges, rural police forces like Devon and Cornwall Police continue to receive some of the lowest funding per head in England. And in Cornwall alone, the population swells by over 3 million during the summer months, placing enormous strain on an already overstretched police force. Meanwhile, the Police and Crime Commissioner for the region costs around £1.5 million a year, factoring in expenses and office costs. This could instead go directly into funding these rural crime teams, officers on the beat instead of office administrators. Also, more than a third of officers in Devon and Cornwall have less than 3 years of service due to difficulties in retention and recruitment caused by chronic underfunding over many years. And despite these clear pressures, the government has failed to reform the funding model to reflect real-world policing demand in our rural communities. Policing should not be a postcode lottery where the most in need are often the least supported. And yet, with all of these issues, we seem to still have no clear government strategy to tackle rural crime. There doesn't appear to be national coordination, nor proper funding structures, and no commitment to equipping rural police teams with the resources they so crucially need. This government could look to organisations like the Scottish Partnership Against Rural Crime, who have had an official rural crime strategy in place since 2019. This strategy focuses on gathering intelligence and raising the confidence in reporting crimes to the local authorities. As a result, the cost of rural crime in Scotland reduced by £2 million from £5.6 million down to £3.6 million in just one single year. The rural crime team established within the Lancashire Police Force is also proving to be an excellent example of a specialised rural crime unit. One resident served by their work said that the police just showing their faces around here has had a massive impact on rural crime for us. It's even led to a massive decrease in fly tipping. That's why, on the 14th of January, I introduced the Rural Crime Strategy Bill, which would require the Home Secretary to establish an independent task force to develop and implement a comprehensive rural crime strategy. That task force must bring together stakeholders from across industry, police, and rural communities themselves to advise the government, ultimately leading to a strategy which could take vital steps, such as ensuring there are properly funded, dedicated rural crime teams or specialists embedded in police forces, because currently just less than 1% of police officers are assigned to rural crime. Providing training for police and 999 control room staff on how to tackle rural crime, and improving intelligence sharing among different individual forces. So to conclude, Madam Chair, rural crime is clearly a very serious, very organised and very devastating issue for our countryside communities. It's time for a cohesive national strategy, one that puts an end to the chaos of underfunded police forces, uncoordinated responses, and gives teeth to legislation to tackle these problems. Organised crime is thriving, and this government needs to act now, starting by bringing forward a comprehensive rural crime strategy, because our rural communities deserve so much better than this. Thank you.
I want to remind members that they shouldn't mention any live legal cases during the debate. Members should bob if they wish to be called. Interventions must be brief, and we'll come to the front bench at 2:30. Kevin McKenna. The question is, apologies, that this House has considered rural crime. Kevin McKenna.
Thank you, Ms McVeigh. Thank you. It's an honour to serve under your chairmanship. And a massive thank you as well to the Honourable Member for North Cornwall for securing this debate and for actually outlining many of the problems so comprehensively. It was really good to hear his insights and the work that he's already been doing on this, and to particularly around rural thefts and thefts of farm equipment, which is a big issue in my constituency. But I actually wanted to focus here on fly tipping, something that is a huge blight in my constituency of Sittingbourne and Sheppey, but also across the whole of Kent, where it costs in Kent about £1.8 million annually. And the issues, one of my problems with fly tipping is just the name. It's too cutesy. It makes it seem so unimportant, right? Fly tipping, well, fine. But it is a massive environmental scourge. It's a massive scourge on the people that live near it, whether that's in an urban setting, where it's often small scale, lots of people on housing estates, back alleys, and I have that in my constituency in bucket loads, but also these big, huge, illegal dumping tips. I have one of these in my constituency on Raspberry Hill Lane near Iwade just the other day, just yesterday morning in fact. It was on a BBC documentary showing drone footage of the site, real investigation from the BBC journalists into the problems. Now this has been going on for a long time. Residents have raised this issue repeatedly. They have struggled to understand what's been going on to challenge this. And some of the stuff that has been looked at very much involves cross-agency working that has frequently failed. And one of my biggest concerns about fly tipping is, have we got the structures in place to investigate it? Are the right organisations doing the investigations? And actually, do we have the right levels of punitive punishments for the people that are destroying vast swathes of countryside? The site that I'm talking about is right next to a site of special scientific interest. It's an extremely vulnerable area, but it's also right on the edge of a village. And the smell and the noise and the disruption is obvious to everybody as you go past it. And it is, at root, an organised crime issue. This is not happening, whether it's in these big sites or in these small sites, frankly, man in a van dumping stuff in someone's bins or back alley on the street, or the sites as the ones that I'm talking about, of which there are multiple examples of in Kent, where you've got truckload after truckload after truckload, bringing along unprocessed waste, digging it into the ground, leaving it for the birds to eat, leaving it for the birds to spread around nearby farmland. And I don't think it's properly understood how significant the impact it is on people. And also how frustrated many local people are at not getting a response from the authorities about what's going on. It's really hard when reporting this to understand where investigations have got to or whether anyone's looking at it at all. And also, because organised crime is involved, many of my residents have actually been afraid to raise this publicly. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for giving way. You're making a really interesting point about fly tipping as an issue of organised crime. I suppose us on this side of the House also would include in that bracket casual littering that you see every day in towns and villages. but also on the side of motorways. I just wondered if he wanted to say something to that as well, being a real scourge in society.
Oh. I'm very happy to say that. We have a lot of casual littering of things that are thrown out of cars as they go up the A249 between Sheppey and Sittingbourne. It is an issue, and we see articles from time to time about middle-class fly tipping as people, in what's apparently a benign way, putting furniture out the front of their houses to leave them on streets for people to pick up. Honestly, yes, I can see that that's well-meaning or thoughtless. That needs dealing with in one way. All right, that level of littering dealt with in one way. It's the organised criminal side of it. That's what we really need to look at in a much more systematic way. So questions that I have for the Minister is whether the Minister thinks that the Environment Agency is the right organisation to be doing the investigating. It's not really set up as an investigative organisation, but that's where the bulk of digging into the detective work is now falling upon. It's similar to some of the other issues with the Environment Agency, say to do with land drainage, where they're pulled into operational matters, but it's not really what they're set up for. And I'd like some thought from maybe the Minister and hear her thoughts about whether we need to look at how the Environment Agency operates, what its real function is, and whether it should be the investigating agency. I'd also like to look at where it's provable that these are organised criminals, what the actual, what the penalty is for this. I mean, frankly, where some of these landowners have been using it to create an organised illegal dump, I have a question as to whether they should retain the assets in terms of the land, but also the vast fleet of trucks and lorries that they're using for this. It's done on industrial scale. It needs to be addressed not with the fines of a few tens of thousands of pounds, but actually we really need to look at seizing the assets of organised criminals. And I think finally, the most important thing that I want to talk about is it's a market issue. Organised crime at root is they're criminals, but they are serving a market need, and a lot of that's down to regulation and whether the regulations that we have around licensing of waste removal and waste processing are actually incentivising criminal gangs to get involved in this business, obviously in scare quotes, rather than other areas of crime that they might be looking at. And honestly, with so many areas of organised crime, we've got to look at the market forces behind it and see how we can use regulation to disincentivise them, and then hopefully get them as they move into other areas as well. Thank you.
Greg Smith.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I congratulate the Honourable Gentleman for North Cornwall for securing this debate. Whilst I'll talk about the Equipment Theft Prevention Act 2023 in a little bit more detail later in my remarks, I would like to assure him from the comments that he made that GPS units were very much intended as part of that act to be included within scope. They were spoken about extensively at all stages of the debate before that act came into achieved royal assent, and I do urge the Minister to have that in mind as she prepares the necessary statutory instruments to fully bring the Act into force, which I believe have now been promised to come by this summer. But more fundamentally, rural crime is devastating to all rural areas, not least like mine in mid-Buckinghamshire, where the economy is majoritively agricultural and entire communities are centred around farming and the local economy that farming supports. Whether it's theft, hair coursing, fly tipping or antisocial behaviour, to name just a few, the countryside is too often an easy target for criminal gangs looking to make a quick buck. And it is imperative that the government recognises this and takes steps to build on the work that we did as Conservatives in government to tackle and prevent rural crime, particularly over the last few years. According to the Countryside Alliance's 2023 rural crime survey, fly tipping accounted for the most commonly reported crime, to speak to the Honourable Gentleman before me's point, at 37% of cases, followed closely by agricultural machinery theft at 32% and trespassing at 31%. Now, of course, farm machinery, it goes without saying, is clearly essential to the smooth running of farms. These are not just tools, they're the backbone of the entire agricultural machine. Whether it is a combine harvester, a tractor or a high-tech bit of equipment, the cost of replacing these items can run into tens of thousands of pounds. And in 2022 alone, rural crime cost UK farmers over £50 million, with farm machinery theft accounting for a substantial portion of that. NFU Mutual, and let's face it, they insure the vast majority of agricultural machinery in this country. NFU Mutual estimates that the cost of rural crime increased by 4.3% year on year in 2023 to 52.8 million, and the cost, specifically to the point on GPS theft alone, reached an estimated 4.2 million in 2023, which was a 137% increase. Quad bike and all-terrain vehicle theft cost an estimated 3.2 million in 23, up 9% on 2022. And it's not just heavy machinery and equipment that's targeted. Often it's fuel, which is all too easy for organised gangs to simply siphon off, load into a van, and off they go, leaving victims with huge losses and hefty bills to restock. I visited a farm in my constituency last year, actually directly opposite Chequers. It seems like an unlikely place for opportunist thefts to take place, opposite one of the most heavily armed and secured premises in my constituency. But these farmers fell victim to the loss of some 2,000 litres of red diesel that was siphoned off and taken away in the night. On top of, this particular farm operates a very, very good farm shop, and the thieves got away with 2 chest freezers full of meat destined for that shop. You know, that isn't just a huge financial impact on those farmers, on that business, but it's of course equally, and the Honourable Gentleman in his opening speech this debate referenced it, plays a huge toll on those business owners, those farmers' mental health after they have been targeted. Now, these criminal gangs are incredibly difficult to apprehend when operating across county lines, and raids, these raids, even often through the night, take several hours and targeting several farms with criminals heading off great distances with the stolen items. Some are even shipped overseas and sold without any traceability. The ever-evolving nature and sophistication of criminal gangs makes this a severe uphill battle, but it is a battle, Ms McVeigh, that I would put to this House and to the Minister that we are able as a country to win, and that we can defeat these gangs. My private member's bill now act requiring retailers to register ATV sales and ensure vehicles are fitted with unique identifiers in the form of forensic marking will help police forces track those that fall into the wrong hands. And it is the use of GPS trackers and forensic marking on machinery that is already helping those farmers that voluntarily fit it to their equipment to ensure that stolen items can be recovered. Where voluntary applied, law enforcement agencies have followed leads and they have caught criminals before they can profit from their crimes. Now, my Act having achieved royal assent in 2023, I was hopeful that the regulations required, the secondary legislation, would have been passed before the general election got called last year. That was not to be, or passed quickly after it. But I am assured from commitments that have been made in the main chamber that those pieces of secondary legislation are coming, and I would be grateful if the Minister could reconfirm that in her summing up later, that the summer is still the intended point of arrival, that we can debate those in a delegated legislation committee. Another common sense piece of legislation passed under the last government was the Police Crime Courts and Sentencing Act, which increased the maximum sentence for hair coursing from a fine to 6 months in prison. But it's not just the legislation that's making a difference, it's the commitment of local law enforcement. In Buckinghamshire, Thames Valley Police have been working tirelessly to track down and apprehend those responsible for thefts and other rural crime. Increased patrols, better surveillance systems, and collaboration with local farmers and rural communities have contributed to a drop in farm machinery theft in areas where these initiatives have been rolled out. With the support of Thames Valley Police's Police and Crime Commissioner Matthew Barber, I would actually argue that Thames Valley is leading the way with a commitment in the 24-25 policing budget for an uplift in officers to tackle rural crime. In fact, a doubling of Thames Valley's rural crime task force. The National Rural Crime Unit has been referenced earlier in this debate. That launched in March 22 some years ago has made a huge impact, and the Rural Crime Task Force in Thames Valley, led by Stuart Hutchings, has really been a trailblazer feeding into that. And they've already seized more than £5 million worth of property, including vehicles, drugs, plant machinery and tools, as well as completing hundreds of investigations and supporting hundreds of people with crime prevention advice. I would like to pay particular tribute to the National Rural Crime Unit, led by Superintendent Andy Huddleston, who was instrumental in helping put my bill together and who I very much value as a friend and someone who I look to for sage advice. That unit has recovered stolen property, including agricultural machinery and vehicles, worth £10 million since 2023. It's coordinated operational responses across the UK that resulted in multiple arrests, as well as disrupting organised crime groups. The National Construction and Agri-Theft Team, which sits under the NRCU, seized £3.1 million worth of stolen vehicles and machinery in 2023 alone. And even in the last few weeks, this coordinated approach, started by the last government and hopefully continued by this one, has produced significant results following a series of hair coursing and associated antisocial behaviour incidents across the southeast and east of England, with key arrests made by Cambridgeshire Police with support from Thames Valley Police. This reinforces the effectiveness of intelligence sharing and coordination between forces that makes entire regions and the whole country safer by stopping these gangs from operating. So to conclude, Ms McVeigh, rural communities in Buckinghamshire and the whole country deserve the same level of protection as urban areas. We must ensure our hard-working farmers are able to focus on what they do best, feeding the nation, without the looming threat of theft, intimidation or criminal damage hanging over their heads. And I urge the Minister to ensure that the good words that have been said about fighting rural crime under this government so far are turned into a solid reality that will protect rural communities, my own and all those others across the country, in the coming months and years.
Alex Brewer.
Thank you, Ms McVeigh. It is a pleasure to serve with you in the chair. Last week, one of my local farmers told me that in the last 2 years, there have been fewer thefts on his farm. I was thrilled, and I asked him what had led to that, and he told me that everything worth taking had already been stolen. North East Hampshire, my constituency, is a beautiful part of the country. Rolling countryside is peppered with picturesque villages, farm shops, and even a vineyard. Despite being officially classed as semi-rural, it has all the hallmarks of idyllic country life. But beneath this is a troubling picture. Day in, day out, farmers face theft, fly tipping and hair coursing on their land, often accompanied by threats, violence and intimidation. These aren't small isolated incidents in rural pockets. Every farmer I speak to has plenty of experiences to share. These crimes, as we have already heard, are linked to and a major source of funding for organised crime such as drug trafficking and gambling. This in turn affects our towns and returns to our communities in the forms of shoplifting, car theft and county lines drug dealing. Last year there were an estimated 6,600 active county lines in operation, generating an annual criminal profit of £800,000, a figure which is likely to be significantly underestimated. The profitability of rural criminal activity and competing county turf wars in turn increases violence and rural knife crime. There are 22 active organised crime gangs across the country specifically involved in rural crime. The organisation of these groups enables them to take stolen goods across international borders, and farming equipment is frequently traced to Eastern Europe and Africa. The more valuable the crime to the criminal, the more aggressively they will protect it, and farmers are experiencing the impact of this. Isolated farms are exposed, and farmers tell me they receive direct threats of retribution for reporting crimes. Moreover, we know that these rural crimes are often underreported and difficult to prosecute, especially given the ways in which police weaknesses are exploited across county boundaries. Despite the precautions of CCTV, extra locking on gates and digging ditches, the police are usually just too far away to be able to reach the farms quickly enough. The impact of Conservative cuts to policing is still being felt despite recent recruitment of new officers. We're not back to former police officer numbers, and many are not experienced enough to manage the complex and violent nature of rural crime. Hare coursing is particularly lucrative, with betting proceeds running into tens of thousands of pounds on each race. The money goes to criminal gangs, and the farmers are left with damaged fields and dead hares. Criminals know the land so well they can simply duck for cover when they see the blue lights of a police vehicle. And if they do end up in a police chase, they will drive so dangerously that the police are often forced to give up pursuit. The knowledge that they can avoid police action and prosecution has made criminals in rural areas, including mine in North East Hampshire, increasingly brazen. They'll drive over fields of crops 3 or 4 times a season, damaging fields which support our food security, pushing farmers' insurance bills through the roof and making them feel so threatened that some of them physically cover their head when they move around their own land at night because they expect to be attacked. This is a complex problem that requires a coordinated, deliberate and targeted solution. Hampshire was promised a rural crime task force, but where is it? There has been a lot of talk and very little action. All the while, farmers continue to experience an escalation of crime that is costing Hampshire at least £1.4 million a year. We know what needs to be done, so I call on the Minister and the Government to work with local communities to build up dedicated rural crime units, increase specialist training for new police officers and forge collaboration across county boundaries. Many of the solutions lie in planning policy partnerships, partnerships with industry and prevention as much as with policing. We have the knowledge. Now we need the strategy, the leadership and the action. Farmers have had a hard deal recently and our food security is at risk. It's time for the government to step up to ensure the safety and dignity of our farmers and to put an end to the distress that rural communities are facing. Our farmers are the backbone of this country. It's time we give them the fair deal they deserve. Thank you.
Patrick Spencer.
Thank you very much. Speaker, it is wonderful to see you in your place, and can I pay credit to the member for North Cornwall for securing this debate. I come to this debate today representing a predominantly rural constituency with low crime rates. Now, those low crime rates have been built up by focusing on 3 things: increasing police numbers, effective police strategies, and a strong local economy that has seen the age-old problem of poverty driving crime rates minimised. So can I start by paying tribute to my Police and Crime Commissioner, Tim Passmore, and the hard-working people serving Suffolk Constabulary. But this positive headline negates 2 fundamental realities. It does not portray the changing nature of crime across Suffolk and other rural areas. Specifically, the proliferation of crime in our agricultural sector and on farms, fly tipping, something that was raised by the Honourable Member earlier, poaching, damaging heritage and historical sites, at logistics hubs and warehouses, and, awfully, hidden crime such as sexual exploitation and domestic violence have tragically become all too prevalent in rural communities. Now, secondly, the positive headlines also ignore the fact that Suffolk Constabulary have to police both a very rural countryside with low population density over a large geographic area, as well as urban crime in Ipswich. And that ability to cover very different environments and very different types of crime presents huge challenges to many rural police forces, whether they be in North Cornwall, Suffolk, Essex, Hampshire, wherever. We've already heard that the Countryside Alliance Rural Survey estimates more than a third of people living in rural communities experience rural crime every year. And as the Honourable Member from North Cornwall said, the NFU estimate that the cost of rural crime increased by nearly 5% last year to £52.8 million. The situation facing rural police forces is indeed tough. So in the short time I have here, can I ask the Minister to comment or give me a steer on this government's intent on the following? Earlier this week, I had the opportunity to take part in Home Office oral questions, and I took the opportunity to raise the long-term problem, and it is long-term. I accept that. I accept that the previous government did not do nearly enough to tackle the confusing nature of our funding formula. But I wanted to ask if the long-term problem of looking at the funding formula for rural constabularies. Rural constabularies, as I said on Monday, consistently receive less money than urban ones. Will the Minister agree to publish the formula, publish the methodology, and launch a consultation on reforming it so we can move on and away from this iniquity? Secondly, on the National Rural Crime Unit. Now, the NRCU was set up by the last government, and it has made great strides, along with the Equipment Theft Prevention Act that my honourable friend from Mid-Buckingham has been epic in his pursuit for. But the NRCU has, however, the NRCU has a very limited mandate. Could it not expand to tackling other forms of crime that we know proliferate in rural areas, such as fly tipping, such as organised crime, such as rural DV? Because at the moment, it is, I'm afraid to say, somewhat limited in its pursuit of crime around equipment theft, GPS theft, and other things that are specific to perhaps agriculture and farming. Expanding its remit, and with extra funding, it could support rural police forces with intelligence on tackling problem areas. Finally, and I'd like to ask the Minister this, what steps is this government taking to invest in technology that will help deter and tackle rural crime? Yes, police forces do need cars and coppers. Some of the things the Honourable Member from North Cornwall mentioned earlier around public faith in our police to turn up and tackle crime. Just over recess, my next-door neighbour was broken into. Did the police turn up? No, they didn't. It was deeply disappointing. Yes, we need cars and coppers, but we also need drones that can react 10 times quickly to theft on a farm. They need AI tools, monitoring CCTV, so that are able to pick up potential targets and suspects. Technology may be expensive up front, but the savings in the long term will be substantial. Rural crime is not just about farms and tractors. It has a real impact on people, lives and livelihoods, and it is too often underestimated here in Westminster. Thank you very much.
Chris Blow.
Thank you, Ms McVeigh. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And first must I congratulate the member of North Cornwall for securing this vital debate on rural crime and giving such a comprehensive overview of the many challenges facing our rural communities that perhaps I will make my speech slightly shorter than it had planned to be. Although my constituency is named simply Redditch, some members would have noticed that I often refer to it as Redditch and the Villages. This is because whilst the Boundary Commission has found it fit to change the layout of my constituency on many occasions, it has yet to update its title. In addition to the town of Redditch, my constituency is vast and contains many beautiful rural communities and villages. Tomorrow I'll be walking with local councillors in the Dodderhill parish part of my constituency, and I know the issue of rural crime will feature heavily in those important conversations when we speak face-to-face with constituents. Particularly fly tipping remains one of the biggest concerns of my residents, my local businesses and my farmers, with many selflessly cleaning up after others' thoughtless actions and the organised dumping of waste by nefarious actors. As mentioned by the Honourable Member for Mid-Buckinghamshire, the Countryside Alliance Rural Crime Survey of 2023 shows that fly tipping is the most reported rural crime in our communities, and that 73% of respondents said that fly tipping was on the increase. A 2024 National Farmers Union survey found that more than half of its respondents said that they had experienced small-scale fly tipping on their farm, while over a quarter said they had experienced large-scale fly tipping. Fly tipping on private land is often underreported. This is because responsibility for dealing with fly tipping on private land rests with private landowners and is not subject to mandatory data reporting. I wonder if the Minister in her remarks might reference whether the government might reconsider this so that we can always get the true scale of fly tipping on private land across this country. I welcome the government's decision to introduce mandatory digital waste tracking in 2026 to prevent bad actors from getting away with fly tipping in our communities. Currently, there is no comprehensive method for tracking waste produced in the United Kingdom, and existing systems are fragmented across the country and utilise a mix of digital and paper storage. This initiative will enhance the regulation of waste management by transforming how environmental regulations monitor compliance and prioritise their regulatory activities. It aims to help prevent waste-related crimes such as fly tipping, and it will help, hopefully, if we know where waste is coming from, we'll be able to do more on punitive actions against those organised crime networks that are exploiting our rural communities and costing my businesses millions of pounds. There are, of course, many other rural crimes issues that will come up on the door tomorrow, varying from car theft, tool theft, as mentioned by the Honourable Member, burglaries, farm machinery being stolen, often made easier by our proximity to the motorway network, and continued incidents of antisocial crime that continue to worry my residents. That is why I welcome the Home Secretary's commitment to ensure that our rural communities will see the benefits of this government's promise to enhance our neighbourhood policing teams. Finally, I would like to thank our existing policing teams, Harvington, Norton and Dodder Parish Councils, for their hard work in combating rural crime and ensuring our beautiful villages remain great places to live.
John Lamont.
Thank you very much, Ms McVeigh. As ever, it's an absolute pleasure to serve with you in the chair. And I congratulate the Honourable Member for North Cornwall for securing this important debate. The Scottish Borders is home to many people who rely on agriculture, forestry and tourism for their livelihoods. These communities are tight-knit with deep-rooted traditions, but they're also isolated. And this geographical isolation often makes them more vulnerable to crime. Crimes such as livestock theft, vandalism and break-ins at farmhouses and outbuildings are just a few examples of the challenges that farmers and rural residents face. As we've heard, rural crime is going up, and it's going up fast, rising by 34.9% in 2023 compared to the previous year, and is costing the UK £52.8 million in 2023, according to NFU Mutual. Livestock theft remains a particularly disturbing issue, with cattle, sheep and even horses being stolen from fields or transported to markets without detection, with NFU Mutual claiming this cost around £2.7 million in 2022. Another crime that has been on the rise is the theft of agricultural equipment. Tractors, trailers, quad bikes and tools, vital assets for those who work the land, are all being stolen, sometimes in broad daylight. According to NFU Mutual, of the £1.8 million estimated total cost of rural crime in Scotland in 2023, £1.1 million of that related to machinery theft. Now, these just aren't petty thieves, but sophisticated and organised criminal gangs, often travelling up from England. The impact of such crimes goes far beyond the... Sorry, apologies to colleagues. I will explain a little bit later what I mean by that. I'm not coming out with some anti-English rant here, but the impact of these crimes goes far beyond the immediate financial loss. It disrupts the day-to-day operations of those affected, causing distress to families and results in significant delays that can alter the wider rural economy. So what can we do to address this issue? Now, much of this policy area is devolved to the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament, and my MSP colleague, Rachel Hamilton, has recently presented a bill to the Scottish Parliament that would replicate UK legislation enacted in the last Parliament by my honourable friend, the member for Mid-Buckingham, who's already highlighted today the importance of his bill and what it will achieve when it's finally fully enacted. This Scottish bill, brought forward by my colleague in the Scottish Parliament, will help tackle rural crime in Scotland head-on. Additionally, it is clear that rural crime cannot be tackled through traditional policing methods alone. A more comprehensive, multifaceted approach is required. First and foremost, we must ensure that our police forces in rural areas are properly resourced. And I pay tribute to the local police officers on the Scottish borders who do a tremendous job engaging with the rural community and the farmers in my constituency to ensure that they are doing everything they can to protect and prevent this type of crime happening. But their hands are tied behind their back because the SNP government have not done enough to resource local policing. They focus too much in the central belt of Scotland and don't allocate enough resource to rural areas like the Scottish borders. It's unfortunate there's no SNP members here today to perhaps explain why they don't fund my local police in the way that we all would expect. Ms McVeigh, we must provide additional funding for policing services in rural communities, ensuring that officers have the training and equipment they need to address the unique challenges of rural crime and improving communication between local farmers and the police. We also need to recognise the role of preventative measures. As rural communities become more connected through technology, we must harness that power to reduce crime. Surveillance technologies such as CCTV cameras, automatic number plate recognition systems and livestock tagging can all be used to monitor activity and deter potential criminals. Rural watch schemes, where communities come together to report suspicious activity and share information, are another effective means of prevention. By encouraging the use of these technologies, we can create a more proactive approach to tackling rural crime. However, while technology and policing are vital, local residents and communities have an important role to play too. We must empower them to be part of the solution. Community-led initiatives such as neighbourhood watch schemes and local crime prevention workshops can provide valuable support to law enforcement. Now, Ms McVeigh, this resulted in some good news in my own constituency just last week. Scottish Borders Police reported that a quad bike stolen from Jedburgh was recovered after a member of the public had seen the bike being loaded into the rear of a van. They contacted the police, which allowed officers to trace the van, which resulted in the thieves being arrested. Finally, we must all work collaboratively with farmers and landowners to develop strategies for crime prevention and resilience. Farming is at the core of the Scottish Borders economy, and it is essential that we protect those who sustain it. Engaging farmers in conversations about crime, sharing best practices for security and offering training on how to protect their property will help to build a more secure and resilient agricultural sector. Now, I'm asked for the Minister, in light of what I said earlier about much of this policy space being devolved, is a commitment to ensure this proper cross-border engagement. As I alluded to earlier, much of the challenges we face in the Scottish Borders does come from the urban conurbations further south. Some come from Edinburgh as well, but all the police reports suggest coming from Newcastle and the urban areas around Newcastle are presenting us with particular challenges. So I would just like to ask that there is better engagement or more engagement between the police forces on either side of the border. That does happen already, but I think to ensure we are ahead of the game on this, more needs to be done. In conclusion, Ms McVeigh, rural crime in the Scottish Borders is a growing issue that demands our attention. While the challenges may be unique to rural areas, there are solutions that apply across the board. By working together, by providing adequate resources to our police, leveraging technology and supporting local communities, we can ensure that people in rural communities like the Scottish Borders feel safe, secure and supported. Our rural communities are the lifeblood of this country, and we must do all we can to support them. Thank you. Yeah.
We now move to the front bench. Liberal Democrat spokesperson Lisa Smart.
Thank you very much, Ms McVeigh, and it really is a pleasure to serve with you in the chair as a fellow North Western MP. For too long, our rural communities have been subjected to far too much rural crime, but time and again, previous governments have failed to take these crimes seriously enough and have left police forces understaffed, under-resourced and thus ill-prepared. So now the new government has the opportunity to take real action to address rural crime, and the Liberal Democrats will continue to fight to make sure rural crime is tackled properly, starting with a real strategy and real resources for our police. And we look forward to scrutinising the government's plans for crime and policing as the current legislation makes its way through the process. In 2023, as others have mentioned, the NFU reported that the cost of rural crime rose to £52.8 million, up nearly 22% since 2020. farmers and rural business owners are left to pick up the pieces, facing huge financial losses. And rural crime doesn't just hit wallets. It takes a toll on people's well-being, because the NFU also said in its survey, it found that 86% of farmers say that rural crime is negatively affecting their mental health. And so we need to see more from this government. Now, I'm lucky enough to represent the wonderful constituency of Hazel Grove, and we have urban, suburban and some semi-rural communities within it. And while there are trends and similar issues affecting the whole community, off-road bikes are just as annoying in Marple as they are in Woodley, certain crimes disproportionately affect the more rural areas of my patch. In High Lane, constituents have raised real concerns with me about the impact low population density can have on criminals' ability to commit crime. So it just makes sense if you think about it. It is easier to steal a quad bike or some livestock if the barn it's kept in is several miles from the nearest neighbour. The Minister and I have spoken before about the importance of neighbourhood policing, and I think she and I agree on that, but I've spoken with local police officers from my patch, and they tell me they just don't have the resources or the tools to catch offenders, and too many of our communities are left to deal with the consequences. And that's why we're pushing for a dedicated rural crime strategy, which is sorely needed. Yeah. As the Honourable Member for Berwickshire, Roxburgh and Selkirk mentioned, we are not just talking about petty theft. Much of rural crime is driven by organised criminal gangs. And according to the National Rural Crime Network, there are at least 22 active gangs stealing farm machinery, vehicles and GPS equipment, then selling them onto the black market. And this contributed to a loss of over £4 million in 2023 alone. These gangs exploit the fact that police forces are stretched thinly. They are often working across county and police force borders in order to evade capture. And criminals know rural policing is underfunded and overstretched, and so they're taking full advantage. Freedom of information requests show that less than 1% of police officers in England and Wales are dedicated to specialist rural crime teams. And many police forces lack the basic tools they need, like, as others have mentioned, mobile ANPR cameras and rural drone kits. How can we expect our dedicated police to fight rural crime without the right resources? The Countryside Alliance reports that nearly half of rural residents, 49%, feel the police don't take rural crime seriously enough. And 2/3 think reporting it is just a waste of time. And this is something I hear from my own constituents. Ian from Mellor reported repeated instances of those riding those irritating illegal off-road bikes, terrorising his street. And when his wife calls the police, she waits 20 minutes plus on hold each time. Month after month, nothing is seen to be done. The Lib Dems will fight to keep rural communities safe. We'll continue to give rural crime the attention it deserves, and I want to really commend my honourable friend, the member for North Cornwall, for securing this important debate today. I think he spoke with eloquence and with a clarity around the issues and some of the things we would like to see as Lib Dems to tackle these issues. I'd be particularly keen to hear from the Minister about her thoughts on his rural crime strategy bill. There have been some other really strong contributions, I think, from members across Westminster Hall today. I think the Honourable Member for Sittingbourne and Sheppey made a really interesting point about the language that we use when we're talking about fly tipping. And I agree with him that it diminishes the issue. And I think it's a similar issue around shoplifting. And it makes it sound like almost a little bit of fun rather than a really serious problem. And I think some of the work that's been done around calling it shop theft rather than shoplifting, I think, is really good. He also made interesting points around investigation and enforcement. I thought that the Honourable Member for Mid-Buckinghamshire, in commenting about Chequers being a low-crime area, if I were a mischievous person, Miss McVeigh, I might make a comment about some of the people who may have stayed over at Chequers in the past, but I'm not a mischievous person, and so that point can be left to somebody else. My honourable friend from North East Hampshire made some really important points about police numbers and about the real importance of that coordinated and targeted approach, and I thoroughly endorse her comments. I was really glad, actually, that the member for Central Suffolk and North Ipswich mentioned some of those hidden crimes, so talking about sexual exploitation and domestic violence that occurs in rural communities. I thought that was a really important point to make at that point of the debate. And the Honourable Member for Redditch and, of course, the villages, talking about how our brilliant rural communities take these matters into their own hands when they have to, clearing up after inconsiderate illegal fly tipping. The Lib Dems' comprehensive plan to tackle rural crime includes establishing a permanent national rural crime coordinator to work across police forces and share best practice. We would embed a properly funded, dedicated rural crime team in every police force, which would include a single point of contact for local communities. And at the very least, I urge the government to provide rural crime-specific training for police and 999 control room staff, including in metropolitan forces like my own Greater Manchester Police. Increase access to the technology needed to detect and deter rural crime, and streamline communications between rural crime officers and the communities they serve, including via WhatsApp, for a quick intelligence sharing reporting tool. Because that's what a real rural crime strategy would look like. Real action, real funding and real support for our rural communities. Thank you.
Yeah.
Opposition spokesperson Robbie Moore.
Thank you very much, Mrs McVeigh, and it's a pleasure to serve with you in the chair. And can I thank the honourable member for North Cornwall for securing this important debate, and for all of those members here in the House for their contributions. Crime is often perceived as an issue confined to the cities and metropolitan areas. While it is true that crime rates are often higher in these areas, it is easy to overlook the unique challenges of policing within rural communities. Because the reality is, as has been quite eloquently said by many members in today's debate, rural crime is often a complex picture for the police, ranging from minor incidences of antisocial behaviour to organised criminal gangs exploiting our rural communities, with machinery theft, livestock theft, fly tipping, county lines, indeed many of the issues that have been outlined today. And as my honourable friend for Central Suffolk and North Ipswich rightly outlined, there are many of those hidden challenges associated with rural crime that are very complex in nature but need absolutely the full weight of the attention by the police. And as the NFU Mutual Rural Crime Report indicated, the cost of rural crime has risen again this year to 52.8 million. But we know that the cost is likely to be substantially more given the way in which insurance policies work with those thefts that have taken place. Research from the National Rural Crime Network concluded that there is an unprecedented level of rural offences that have been taken place by organised crime, with their data sets illustrating the very point, which has led to a focus by that unit in making sure that they are collectively working with all stakeholders that are willing to give a level of interaction with them, but in making sure that all police forces are being as collaborative as possible in their nature. And therefore, it is integral that the police have the full range of powers and resources available to them to tackle rural crime. And it is imperative for the government to work effectively with the Rural Police Chiefs Council to ensure that the next rural and wildlife crime strategy reflects the priorities of our rural communities. And I want to go through some of the themes that have been raised in this debate. Fly tipping has absolutely been mentioned by all members. Fly tipping is absolutely an attack on our community's nature and environment. It endangers wildlife and people alike, and harm caused by these criminals must not go unpunished. For this reason, DEFRA granted support under the previous Conservative administration to 58 local authorities to specifically enable them to provide additional enforcement powers. And I welcome the government's intention to act on fly tipping in the Crime and Policing Bill. However, it appears that what seems to be coming forward from the government is to be simply providing limited statutory guidance for local authorities. And therefore, I'd be interested to hear from the Minister what extent the guidance will help those local authorities in dealing specifically with further increasing the powers that have been made available to them, and what guidance will this specifically seek to achieve? Will it be accompanied by any additional financial support that has previously been made available to those local authorities under the previous Conservative administration, and will it enable further enforcement action? Because we know that fly tipping is probably one of the most prolific categories of rural crime experience. Indeed, this has been mentioned by the member for Sittingbourne and Sheppey, the member for Buckinghamshire, and indeed the member for Berwickshire, Roxburgh and
and Selkirk, because NFU members in their survey found that 54% had experienced small-scale fly tipping on farm, while over a quarter, 30%, said that they had been hit by large-scale industrial fly tipping. DEFRA statistics, even from January 23, show that fly tipping is estimated to cost the economy £924 million alone in England. And worryingly, incidences of fly tipping, of large commercial amounts of fly tipping that is taking place is just ever increasing. Some costing some local authorities around the region of £13.2 million. I will give way.
On the point about fly tipping, does he agree with me with many councils closing tips and other community services? There's almost no other option for some residents to have to dispose of materials. Obviously, fly tipping is illegal, but when councils are cutting back services like tips, and there's very often no other alternative but for residents to do that. And that's not a defence of that action. It's totally unacceptable, but when there's no other option, some people are forced to do that.
Robbie Moore.
And of course, as my right honourable friend makes absolutely clear, fly tipping hits every part of our community. And when you are seeing household waste and recycling centres close, indeed in my own constituency of Keighley and Ilkley, Bradford Council has made the decision very recently to close 2 household waste and recycling centres, and that has absolutely resulted in more fly tipping taking place, not only in those parts of the rural environment that sit in the urban fringe, so to speak, but actually sometimes in the most isolated of rural places. And that is something that is incredibly detrimental to many of our constituents. I would very much like to see, as we've advocated for previously, a single reporting mechanism for fly tipping that should be developed, which enables it easier for police forces to be able to manage the levels of reporting that take place, because this is absolutely something that needs to continue to have the priority of all governments going forward. Hair coursing has also been mentioned. Another crucial aspect is the need for intervention to prevent wildlife crimes, and thanks go to all of those that were involved in bringing forward the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, which passed by the last previous Conservative administration, where hair coursing now carries the appropriate punishments that recognise the damage it causes, with powers in place to impose custodial sentences, indeed mentioned by the member for Mid Buckinghamshire. As the Sentencing Council stated in its January 2025 consultation, the courts now have a fuller suite of sentencing powers, including new ancillary orders to deal with hair coursing offences. For the many, hair coursing may seem like this is an abstract issue, but for very many of those members representing very rural constituencies, this is absolutely an offence which continues to take place, unfortunately. But as a result of that bill passing, there has been instances reported, and it is encouraging to see, Mrs McVeigh, that only as of Tuesday this week, 16 people had been arrested for this crime. However, this underscores the need for the police to ensure that offenders are properly punished. It is highly encouraging that in areas where police forces are taking part in Operation Galileo, hair coursing has decreased by 40%. And as I mentioned earlier, the Sentencing Council is consulting on updating its guidance to reflect instances of this crime, and I'd be grateful for the Minister to keep the House updated on this. And the other big issue that has been mentioned, without doubt, is machinery and diesel theft. Based on data from both the NFU and the Countryside Alliance, one of the most impactful crimes affecting rural communities is theft of agricultural machinery, including vehicles. And data sets from the NFU indicated that thefts from agricultural goods cost over £10 million, which is an incredibly shocking amount, and that is just within the recent previous year. And I just want to pay a huge amount of credit to my honourable friend, the member for Mid Buckinghamshire, who brought forward the Private Members Bill for the Equipment Theft Prevention Bill, which I think gained royal assent back in 2003. The bill provided the government and the police with wider powers to tackle increasing incidents of vehicle and equipment theft on farms, such as quad bikes and ATVs, focusing on prevention. But there is still, as has been indicated consistently from my honourable friend, need for secondary secondary legislation. It is comforting, I believe, to hear that this legislation is potentially going to be presented before the House by summer. But this government needs to pass this secondary legislation to ensure that it includes other wider agricultural equipment, such as power tools, that has already been mentioned by my right honourable friend. I just want to go on to livestock worrying that has also been mentioned by members in this House. Livestock worrying obviously involves dogs which are not being kept under proper control, attacking or chasing livestock. And the NFU Mutual found that farm animals worth an estimated 2.4 million were killed by livestock worrying in 2023 alone, which is a rise of 33% from the previous year. Death is not always because of physical attacks or injury, and I worry, with the lambing season now getting underway, that this will only become something that fills all of our inboxes as we go forward over the spring months ahead. A critical piece of animal welfare legislation, the Dogs Protection of Livestock Amendment Bill, which was first introduced under the last government, is now slowly moving its way back through the legislative system. And I noted that it made progress on the 29th of November just last year as it passed through its second reading in the House of Commons unopposed, having been reintroduced by my honourable friend, the member for Chester South and Eddisbury. But could I ask for the government to make sure that this does allow for time to move through the House as quickly as possible, because this is a much needed piece of legislation that would provide much comfort to many of our livestock farmers, because the bill aims to address the growing issue of livestock worrying by enhancing protections for farmers, introducing tougher penalties for offenders and expanding police powers. It expands the definition of livestock as well, Mrs McVeigh, introduces unlimited fines for offenders and grants police powers to be able to seize suspected attacking animals and, of course, collect DNA evidence, which will help with evidence that needs to be collected so that prosecution can take place. And finally, Mrs McVeigh, I just want to reiterate the need for all of our police forces to work collectively and collaboratively to deal with rural crime. Much of our rural crime, as always normally gets referenced, takes place in much isolated instances, but indeed, as the member for Berwickshire, Roxburgh and Selkirk has indicated, there needs to be cross-border interaction, but also making sure that those police forces, like mine in West Yorkshire, that predominantly deal with more of an urbanised base, but do have some very remote rural fringes attached to it, are focused on rural crime just as much as those police forces that have more rural areas to deal with. So, Mrs McVeigh, the fact that rural crime is often at the bottom of our local... the fact seems to be that rural crime is often at the bottom of our local leaders' priorities and our police forces' priority lists. It is difficult to measure, is often difficult to observe, and the impacts are generally impacted by fewer people. Rural crime can be reduced, but it requires not just investment, but an understanding and a prioritisation of decision makers across all branches of local and national government. On this side of the House, we are determined to put the prioritisation of rural crime in focus, and I hope that the Minister will be able to match the commitment on this side of the House.
If the Minister could leave a few moments for the member who's brought the motion to wind up. Minister.
Thank you very much, and it is a pleasure to serve under you this afternoon, Ms McVeigh. And I want to start by, of course, congratulating the Honourable Member for North Cornwall for securing this debate, as well as the Private Members Bill in his name, which is currently before the House. And I am very grateful for the very clear way that he set out the serious nature of rural crime, and particularly the involvement of organised criminal gangs in rural crime. And I'm also very grateful for everyone's contribution this afternoon, and I think it's shown a great degree of insight, and the passion for this issue has been very clear. I wanted just to comment first of all on the Honourable Member for North Devon, who talked about the thefts of the quad bike and the chainsaw, which I think almost every member who spoke in the debate talked about those types of thefts. I want to also just refer to the contributions of my honourable friends for Sittingbourne and Sheppey, and my honourable friend for Redditch, who talked with a lot of knowledge about fly tipping in particular. and the particular questions that have been posed actually by a number of members today about what more we can do to tackle fly tipping. What I want to do is I want to take away some of the challenges that have been made this afternoon in terms of fly tipping, but I did just want to refer to the provisions in the Crime and Policing Bill, which had its first reading this week in the House. And through that bill, there will be a power to issue statutory guidance to ensure that consistency and robust enforcement of fly tipping. But I heard very much the concerns about the organised crime, criminals that are involved in fly tipping, and whether the Environment Agency is the most appropriate enforcement agency there. But I will certainly write to the honourable member with some of the issues that were raised this afternoon on fly tipping. The honourable member for Mid Buckinghamshire, I think we all want to say a very big thank you to him for his work on that Equipment Theft Prevention Act. And we are working very hard on the statutory the statutory instrument that needs to come forward, and I'm going to say something about that in my remarks in a moment. But I also was concerned about the comments he made about the thefts around Chequers. That is of concern to me as the Policing Minister. We also heard from the Honourable Member for North East Hampshire and her contribution around the particular effect in her constituency, and she spoke again about hair coursing, an issue that a number of Honourable Members raised. And then the Honourable Member for Central Suffolk and North Ipswich raised the funding issue. Fully accept this is something that many are concerned about, and I'm going to say something about that in my remarks in a moment. He also talked very importantly about the use of technology, AI and drones, again, something that is really important, not just in urban areas, but in rural areas too. And also about some of the issues that we didn't really touch on today, but domestic abuse, which we know is a problem in rural areas, sexual exploitation, those are issues in areas rural and urban. And then the Honourable Member for Berwickshire, Roxburgh and Selkirk, who gave us the Scottish perspective, and also talked about the need for that cross-border work with Police Scotland and English police forces. So, having set all of that out, it's really clear that this is an important issue to many honourable members and their constituents. And I just want to say that I do take these issues very seriously as well. I went on a visit to North Yorkshire 2 weeks ago, and I had the privilege of meeting farmers who had been subject to farm thefts, had lost quad bikes, talked to them about how that made them feel, actually, and the issue of safety and security, but also obviously a loss to their businesses. And also to farmers who were seeing hair coursing in their fields, were seeing crops destroyed, damage to gates, and again, how they felt about that. So I fully recognise these are important issues. And the police who I met, who were policing that rural area in North Yorkshire, one of the things that struck me was they talked about how the community, whilst it was dispersed, wanted to work with the police. So WhatsApp groups have been set up to provide information and intelligence that the police could then use because of the nature of the geographical area that the police were having to cover. So that is really quite important, that assistance from the community. Now, it has been a wide-ranging debate, and I just want to deal with a few issues. So first of all, I think it's really clear that the types of offending that we've been discussing this afternoon affect the lives and livelihoods of decent, law-abiding people. Those who have been victims of crime in rural communities have often indicated that they feel that they've been left feeling isolated and undervalued, and I think we need to change that. No victim of crime and antisocial behaviour should feel unsafe, and that their concerns should be taken seriously, and that if they report, action will be taken. In the National Rural Crime Network's annual Rural Crime Report in 2024, 49% of rural residents surveyed suggest that they do not feel the police take rural crime seriously and report a sense of dissatisfaction with and lack of faith in rural policing. And this may be because of the lack of visibility in policing in rural areas or negative experience when a crime is reported. Now, we're not going to stand for this anymore, which is why we have made safer streets one of the core missions of our plan for change. And it's why we are committed to restoring neighbourhood policing to communities across the country, including in rural areas. And it's why we're taking action to crack down on criminals and protect the public. So we will be implementing the new neighbourhood policing guarantee to deliver an additional 13,000 police officers, PCSOs and special constables in neighbourhood policing roles, ensuring that every community has a named officer to turn to. So these policing commitments will not just be about towns and cities, they will also be for rural communities too, speeding up response times and building that public confidence in all these areas. Neighbourhood policing, as we all know, sits at the heart of the British policing model. It's a critical building block in helping communities feel safe, and the public rightly expect their neighbourhood police to be visible, proactive and accessible to their community. The National Policing Guarantee will help us deliver our commitment to ensuring that greater visibility, that presence in all of our communities and restoring confidence in policing. Now, beyond this commitment, I just want to say as well that in the 2025-26 police settlement, we've committed to provide funding of up to 19.5 billion for the policing system in England and Wales. And that is an overall increase of up to £1 billion compared to this financial year. And in January 2025, the government announced in the final police funding settlement that it was going to double the funding available to a total of 200 million in 25-26 to support the first steps of delivering on the 13,000 more neighbourhood personnel. And I take the point about the funding formula, and again, as I said in the chamber, the previous government did have now I understand it's 3 attempts at actually changing the formula. We've been in government for 7 months. We have made very clear that we have an agenda around reform of policing to make it fit for the future, to have the structures and the capabilities it needs. That will, of course, involve a conversation about funding. So that will happen as part of our reform agenda. The major investment that I just talked about, I think, though, supports the commitment to making our country's streets safer, our village streets safer. And I think also reflects the scale of the challenges that I fully accept forces are facing and that this government is determined to address. I also want to acknowledge the vital role of the National Rural Crime Unit and the National Wildlife Crime Unit, those specialist policing units playing a really important part in tackling crime as well as helping police across the UK to tackle organised theft and disrupt serious and organised crime groups. Both of these units have delivered a range of incredible successes. The National Rural Crime Unit coordinated the operational response of several forces to the theft of GPS units across the UK that resulted in multiple arrests and the disruption of 2 organised crime groups, as well as recovering over £10 million in stolen property, including agricultural machinery and vehicles, in the last 18 months alone. And the National Wildlife Crime Unit helped disrupt 9 organised crime groups, with a further 9 archived as no longer active, as well as assisting in the recovery of £4.2 million in financial penalties. They also oversee the police national response to hare coursing, which has resulted, as we've heard, in a 40% reduction in offending. And just on this issue around those 2 units, I think I am very clear of the excellent work of both of these units. And whilst we obviously have to wait for the outcome of the spending review, I want to say that this government is committed to supporting the ongoing specialist policing activities of these 2 units. And I understand the urgency to confirm funding, but I hope that we won't have to wait too much longer before we're able to update the House on that issue. I also just want to refer to the issue of a national focus on rural crime. We will be continuing to support the National Police Chiefs Council on the next iteration of their rural and wildlife strategy, 2025 and beyond. And I recently met with the DCC Nigel Harrison and Superintendent Andrew Huddleston, who I know the Honourable Member for Mid Buckinghamshire praised in his speech, to discuss and to ensure that the commitments made under our Safer Streets mission, such as the Neighbourhood Policing Guarantee, will apply in rural areas. Now, on rural crime more specifically, I want to just address a few of the issues. This government is committed to ensuring that countryside communities who are blighted by organised crime, rural theft and antisocial behaviour are protected. We understand the devastating consequences of these types of crimes and the fundamental impact they can have on perceptions of safety. Rural crime and the associated costs have a considerable impact on rural residents and business owners, and significantly, this threat appears to be increasing. For example, we know the significant impact that thefts of agricultural machinery, in particular the all-terrain vehicles, have on individuals and businesses in those rural areas, and the disruption to essential farming work caused when such thefts occur, which is why we are committed to implementing the Equipment Theft Prevention Act 2023, to fend off these thefts and the resale of the high-value equipment. And we intend to introduce the necessary secondary legislation later this year. We will also be publishing the government's response to the call for evidence shortly, which will determine the scope of that secondary legislation. We understand, again, this was an issue raised by many honourable members this afternoon, the impact of cruel hair coursing, livestock worrying, which was also mentioned, and the serious issues, as I've said earlier on, about fly tipping that blight communities. And just on the fly tipping issue, I just want to say that in 22-23, local authorities reported 1.08 million fly tipping incidents. This figure, of course, excludes the majority of private land incidents, which my honourable friend for Redditch was talking about. Now, of course, the same crimes that affect urban communities can also affect rural communities. And I was just talking then about, earlier on, about domestic abuse and exploitation. There's also something else that we need to talk about, and that is, was raised by an honourable member, and that is about drugs and drug dealing and drug supply. We know that county lines is the most violent model of drug supply and a harmful form of child criminal exploitation. These gangs are exploiting children and vulnerable adults to move and store drugs and money, often using coercion, intimidation, violence and weapons. So I just want to reassure honourable members that through the Home Office County Lines programme, we are targeting and will continue to target those exploitative gangs working both in rural areas and in urban areas. It's absolutely the case that no matter where you live, when you report a crime, it should be properly investigated, with victims having faith that justice will be delivered and criminals will be punished. In conclusion, Ms McVeigh, I just want to again thank the honourable member for securing this debate and for all who have spoken. Rural crime is without doubt a serious threat and it must be dealt with as such. That is why we are taking the actions that I've talked about this afternoon and why we have the wide-ranging Safer Streets mission. There's clearly much more to do, but we are determined to deliver the safety and security of all our communities, rural and as well as urban. Thank you.
Ben Maguire to wind up.
Thank you, Ms McVeigh. It's been a pleasure to serve with you in the chair this afternoon. Thank you again to all of the honourable members that have contributed to this debate, and it's great to see such cross-party support and all members taking this issue of rural crime especially seriously. It was excellent to hear from the member for Sittingbourne, Anne Sheppey, who really made an eloquent case about the severity of fly tipping and the blight that's having on so many rural communities. And also the member for Mid Buckinghamshire, who I again congratulate for his Equipment Theft Prevention Act. And I'm delighted to just hear that the Minister has confirmed that the government will be taking that forward, which I think is a really important step. It was excellent as well to hear from my honourable friend, the member for North East Hampshire, where she actually highlighted the violent crime that happens in our rural communities. Just because some of these crimes happen in quaint and beautiful rural settings makes them no less serious. The member for Suffolk and North Ipswich made a series of excellent points, including the need for increased technology, including drones and the use of AI. And the Minister, I'm very pleased to say, has taken all of those matters extremely seriously. I look forward to working with her and also the Shadow Minister, given some of his excellent points as well, on a cross-party basis, because this is such an important issue. I think it takes members from across the House to tackle it. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered a rural crime. As many of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting is suspended until, what time is it? 3 o'clock. Right.